All right. And welcome back, guys, to Self-Selecting Podcast. I am your host, Corey Hagman, and thank you. I just want to thank you for being here, tuning in, continuing to support me, these episodes, the YouTube channel, Patreon. It's been really incredible to see the messages, the comments, like everything. I mean, like it really does feel surreal to receive the feedback. I mean, like that these episodes can, run really deep and, give you some food for thought. And that ultimately, that was the hope with, doing the first one is like, hey, like I know the short form content is helpful, but there are a lot of individuals who have asked and even been like, hey, I want to be able to listen to something that's a little more long form, a little more comprehensive on the same topic. Where can I find it? And, back when I released that first episode, I mean, like I literally was just like, okay, regardless of how many people tune in, regardless of, the direction this kind of goes, I hope that I can offer valuable content and really the kind of value that I was fortunate enough to come across truly like from some of the exact guests that I've had on early on into my journey in the fitness space, bodybuilding space. I was lucky that individuals did that long form content and talked about their experiences and helped me formulate just really the approach I wanted to take, as a physique athlete. But with that being said, I never want it to be confused that like these principles are limited to just those who compete in the space of bodybuilding, because I mean that in itself, like I was talking to one of my clients, Kim, recently, just such a baller. I mean, like we do our weekly calls and like we just wrapped up like week 14, or wrapping up the 14th week, I think, of her fat loss phase. And like this is one of her first times like going through fat loss phase that was non-prep oriented. And like, it was a really good call, really good dialogue around like gearing up for her build and getting her mentally prepared to make that transition, because up until now it was one of those things, I've struggled with this, several other clients have struggled with this, but this is one of the things she presented is like, I didn't know I could move forward with this kind of trajectory and this intention through a phase without there being that definitive like marker of like, okay, this show is now on the horizon, so that's what I'm aiming for. And the fact that we were able to go through a phase like this productive, I mean, she's down like 20 pounds, which is like ridiculous when you think about like with her experience, the way she's dieted in the past, at her age. I mean, like it's really inspiring. And it was cool to kind of reorient going into now her build. I'm like, okay, so like the way you're going to gear up for this is really be getting clear on like what your why is, and in concluding this phase, not because you reached stage, not because you hit the show and like you did it and like now you're off stage, now what else are we gonna do, but because now the next progression for what you need for your physique is to build. And it got me thinking about this topic, and this is essentially what we're going over today, is when do you know, like, okay, the diet's concluded? When do you know, like, you're ready to move into the next phase? And it's like, for her, we were just like, this makes the most sense based on the stage weight, based on how she's feeling, based on the amount of weight that's been lost. The next progression is to go into a build, because she's at the point where it's like, we can clearly see there's muscle needed for the physique that she wants for stage, potentially, and off stage, just for her next fat loss phase. And it really resonates with me, because like, I think a lot of people assume, okay, well, yeah, my goals right now, like the build I'm going through is exclusively for that next time that I compete. And yeah, like I've been like I've made a lot of my identity and like my social presence, largely around kind of competing, kind of not. But in order to be successful on stage, I've said this 1,000 times, I'm going to need more muscle, because I'm not dense enough to hang with some of those top athletes. I was small back in 2021, but like even now I'm like, dude, like they're dense, like they have a lot of size. And like, what I don't want to happen is to get back into a position where I end the fat loss phase, or I get to like, the presumed stage weight, only to find like, okay, the tie-ins are just not there. Or I get to the point where the tie-ins are there, and I then see, well, the upper body and the core, they're too lean. Like they're imbalanced relative to my lower body or my posterior. So various conversations this week around like, finding like helping clients find their why, but then also like really considering, okay, like my own motivation, because I'm pretty deep into a build right now. Like I'm coming up on my 12th week, and it made me think, like, talking with Kim, I was like, okay, well, the things that motivate me, the goals that I have physique wise, would they still require me go through this phase? Yes. Because the way I want to look, the way I want to get down to my leanest my leanest physique, that, sweet spot where I feel like I'm lean, but I'm not stage lean. In order for me to do that, I want to do that without having to have such rigidity, or really, really like pull down so hard to have balance, or I guess lack thereof. And globally, like, if competing wasn't a thing, I feel like where I'm at in my career is like, I've done things that I am very proud of, yes, but I aspired to do more. I aspire to, continue to see progressions on stage. And because of that, that requires this time that just simply, it can't be spent exclusively dieting. It can't be spent at this like weird purgatory where it's just like you're kind of in maintenance, you're a little bit in surplus, you get a little softer, then you pull back down. It's just not productive. And I think for some people, they kind of look at like the end of a diet, like when should you conclude your diet? I mean, typically I think people are forced to end their diet because they just can't continue to hack it. They can't pull away from, they can't pull out of, this idea of like pursuing this goal, because frankly, they haven't reached the goal. But it's typically because either adherence is falling apart, in order to continue to see the progress that they need to see, it's going to require a level of restriction that frankly is just, whether they realize it or not, they're not able to hack. It's not worth the sacrifice. And I see this with a lot of athletes, but a lot of just lifestyle clients who have no plans to compete. They're just like, okay, I'm not quite as tight. I don't have, all the lines that I want to have, but dude, this is hard. Like, it's hard to continue to feel the hunger. It's hard to push through the heavy fatigue. My training is, kind of going shitty at this point. So like, I don't really have, strong sense of really motivation to keep digging deeper. And that's where I think a lot of people will feel as if, okay, well, like I said I was going to do this show, or I said I was going to diet for 12 weeks, 16 weeks, 20 weeks, or said I was going to hit this goal weight. And they don't really consider like, okay, but what is happening in real time? I know this was the original plan, but there is room to course correct. And, like what I hear time and time again from athletes is like, I've already put so much time and energy into this. And this is largely related to individuals who have like that show date in mind. They're like, I can't quit, and this doesn't just apply to dieting. This is like, job, relationship, finishing a show that like, you're not going to be ready for. Like, people are really married to the idea of seeing it all the way out, when in reality, that might not be what's best for them. And I think on some level, those individuals, like when you're in that state, like to some extent, you're like, I can't bring my best. But there's a guilt, there's a shame, centered around like, but I said I was going to do this thing. And like, I'm someone who, I can speak to this because I've been that individual who's been injured during a prep, but I'm like, I can't pull out. Like, I committed to this. I made that commitment. And let me tell you, like, this is one of the biggest mental traps that keeps people stuck and keeps them ultimately in a state that is not productive, and potentially even puts them in a worse state after the fact. So today, what are we going through? Sunk cost fallacy, why it happens, how to recognize it when you're in that state, and most importantly, how to combat it. Okay, so starting with the basics, This concept, this is a logical fallacy, sunk cost fallacy. This is when you keep investing time, energy in money, because money is a big part of what you lose when you make that kind of commitment, certainly around a show. And I mean, like, I can think back and like cringe when I start, divvying up the numbers and like how much I put into these shows that frankly, like I went into and I'm like, I'm not going to be at my best. There's no way. Like I'm so disadvantaged. And in this case, it was because I was injured, like a serious injury. I'm like, but I'm already this far. I'm already as lean as I'm actually too lean. I might as well see it through. And it's like, we all do this. And like the easiest analogy I can make or comparison I can make is when you're in a relationship or you're in like a business venture and it's like clearly going nowhere. Like, I mean, you have more and more like very prevalent signs that like, hey, this is not where you should be. Like, this is not serving you in the way that you had hoped. And oftentimes like the actual venture itself in a relationship, like it's draining you or it's, whatever, it's a bad investment, but you keep going and you're really trying to avoid just wasting what you've already put in. Now, the problem with this though is that it's already sunk. Like it's already lost. You can't get it back. That money, that time, like no amount of push is going to put you in a better position where you can undo that wasted time, that energy. Like it's gone. And really, it's understandable. It's your brain convincing you to stick it out because you're focused on, honestly, the past instead of what the future potentially could hold. Now, as humans, we hate losing. Like losing feels worse than winning feels good. And if you really think about it, like financially, this is probably the easiest way that, it resonates with me, or I guess the most apparent way it resonates with me. Like whenever you lose money, whenever you lose like big sums of money, that sticks with you way more than when you just find money, when you get a little bit of money back. It's that loss aversion that makes us do irrational things. And it's kind of like staying in that bad situation longer than we should, at least gives us some comfort because we're like, well, we saw it through, and just on the off chance that we were wrong and that fear, that anxiety was just our mind playing tricks on us. It's like, yeah, but to what extent? And there's also this need to justify past decisions that like no one wants to come to terms with the fact that like, hey, you already overextended yourself. You lost. Like you're in a bad position. You can't perform. You're not going to be productive. No one wants to feel like they made a bad choice. No one wants to have to like face that. And I think it's really easy to trick yourself and to convince yourself to do this mental manipulation into thinking that by continuing somehow we're validating our original investment. And it's like saying like, okay, well, if we just keep going, eventually it'll be worth it. And the reality is like, I've done this in so many different instances, is like, it's never worth it. You're just prolonging facing that decision that ultimately, if you were to take yourself out of the situation, if you were to look from the outside in, it would probably be very obvious that the best thing you can do is fold. And lastly, there's the ego. And that ultimately is what keeps us stuck. It keeps us in this vicious cycle. And, it makes sense because like admitting that you were wrong sucks. Like, I mean, like the easiest thing to do when you're in that position where you're like, should I call it? Like, I'm not as lean as I wanted to be, but it's very obvious. Like, it's very obvious to people around you. It's very obvious, probably even if you were to take a pause and really get some space from the situation, that like, it's not going to get better from here. And it makes sense because it's like, we want to be right. We want to prove to ourselves that, this state that we're in, that it's not nearly as bad as we thought. And frankly, that if we just tolerate it, maybe it won't be a bad decision at all. So recognizing when you're falling into this trap. The biggest sign is when you start to rationalize why you should keep going, even when logical choice, the thing that makes the most sense, the thing that is the most obvious, is to stop. And this can sound like, okay, well, I've already put so much time into this, I can't really quit now. And I see this a lot with contest prep. People be like, I'm 12 weeks in. If I just push a little bit more the next 12 weeks, I can make up for whatever body fat I haven't lost thus far. Almost Almost never a good idea. Hardly ever. And I would say almost exclusively when people get into this mindset that I'm just going to double up on the fat loss, I'm just going to work harder, you dig yourself into this hole. And like, frankly, there's not a lot that you can do to play catch up towards the tail end because fatigue is already so high. And really, if you are familiar with my methodology with like how you need to approach contest prep, how you need to approach fat loss, is like you should have a plan. You should have one that's thought out, that makes sense. And if that includes, if your plan A is like, well, if I fall behind, I'm just going to keep pushing, I'm just going to work harder at the end. It's like you can only do that to a certain extent before you dig yourself in such a hole that you just can't keep up with the interest that's due. Like, same thing applies in any kind of relationship. And this doesn't have to be just like an intimate relationship. I see this a lot also with like coaches or even professional relationships. We've been together so long, it'd be a waste to break up. And it's like, yes, but again, you're focusing on what you would lose. And you know you're in that sunk cost fallacy when the reasons for continuing are more about not wanting to waste what you've already invested. And for a lot of people, that is the time. That is what they've put in to the greatest extent. And rather than focus on the actual value that you would be getting from moving forward, and it's not about what you stand to gain, it's about what you're afraid of losing. So in this case, like I would say paying attention to the emotions that are driving your decisions. Are you making the choices out of fear of failure? Are you trying to avoid disappointment, or really the realization that like, hey, maybe I haven't been as present as I should have been earlier on, because it would have made a lot of sense earlier on to recognize these signs because they were there. And I think once you start to spot these patterns, you can begin to challenge them. So in the case that we're talking about, like, should you actually keep going? This is the toughest decision that I think someone's going to face when they're amidst like that fat loss phase, like when they're in the thick of it, when they are really in that state of discomfort, especially if you've been dieting for a while and you aren't continuing to see the results that you've expected. And the deeper in that you get, the more you might be thinking, well, I've come this far, I can't stop now. But really, you have to take a step back and, be honest with yourself for a moment. Sometimes the path you're on isn't leading you to where you want to go. Sometimes it is just safer to continue with what you know than to challenge that current situation and potentially remove yourself from it. And frankly, just continuing because you've already put in so much time, because it feels safe, because it feels familiar, it doesn't mean that it's the right move. And the truth is, if your diet isn't aligned with your goals, and like long term, I know like the immediate goal might be, well, like getting to stage, or in the case of a non-competitor, just someone like I'm going to achieve 20 pounds of fat loss in totality. You really have to ask yourself, is this leaving you feeling drained? Like, is this like mentally, and I don't mean like just the physical discomfort of fat loss, but like emotionally, is this still aligned with how you want to execute and how you want to get towards the goal that you're working towards? So really you have to ask yourself is like, okay, how clear is it to you why you're doing what you're doing? And this is really how I would go about like reassessing. These are just the subtle signs that might indicate maybe it's time for a change. So first up, progress feels inconsistent or minimal despite your best efforts. You're putting in work, you're being as adherent as, maybe your coach is asking you to be, but each week the results seem to be slipping further and further out of reach. And yes, like plateaus can happen, and you can have weeks where like maybe fat loss isn't going to be as meaningful or to the degree that you're hoping it will be. But if you've been on this, and like this kills me when I hear people, like this happens all the time, by the way, all the people come to me, they'll be like, I've been dieting for 6 months and I've barely lost 8 pounds. I'm like, what do you mean? Like, when was the last time you saw like meaningful progress? They're like, oh, like 3 months ago. Like since then we've kind of just been coasting. Like we've tried different approaches, but still nothing. Like my body literally hasn't changed for 3 months. You're constantly feeling worn down. Yes, physically, emotionally. And like, again, some of this is expected when you're in a fat loss phase, but what started as a challenge like really just started as like an adjustment to doing the things that you need to do to be in a deficit. Now it's become this chore where it's like every part of what you need to do to be successful, it's just becoming heavier and heavier. And it's ultimately taking a more costly toll on you the longer that you do it. the energy, the focus you had, you're getting none of that. And like I've talked about the adherence scaling criteria with like, 1 to 5, still assuming that you're adherent like across the board. But if you're waking up constantly like at like a 1 or 2 and you're like, like no days of the week am I waking up not wanting to fuck my diet right off. Like every day I'm trying to find loopholes or ways that we can work around the things that I need to do to be successful. The sacrifices no longer feel worth it. And this is one that like I can think back to a time during contest prep where my last prep, I was like, I'm willing to finish this, but I'm kind of done. Like I don't think any amount of success on stage, like it will be appreciated and I'll be proud of it, but I need a break. Like it's just, I'm not willing to continue to feel as bad and as like heavy as the work of this actually is in combination with the other responsibilities that I have at the time. And what you're giving up, I mean, it's your time, your social life, your mental peace. It's starting to feel disproportionate to what you're gaining. And that's where, like, I know that a lot of people, they'll be like, okay, well, you just need to stick it out. Like, it'll be worth it. But the reality is, a lot of times, like more often than not, when you compete, you are not going to get the reward that you truly seek. Because obviously when you compete, like people are like, yeah, I'm going to be proud with whatever the outcome is. And I think you should be process oriented. But as competitors, it does make sense that you're like, I want to win. And statistically, if you just look at like, what are the odds of winning? It's like, not only do you have to be your best, but you have to beat people that frankly, you have no control over how they're going to show up. And if you want like a fair win, like one that is well-deserved, that should mean that truly the only way that you win is by bringing the absolute best to stage. And just frankly, with such a subjective sport, and frankly, just with such a subjective sport, it can be one of those things that can be really disheartening. So, I mean, like I caution people on like that being their primary motivator. And really like when every decision starts to feel like a burden and the joy that should come from that progress has been like replaced by frustration. So like you're really just going through it, just a spin cycle of like, okay, I just need to get through it. I just need to get to the finish line. That to me is a very, very clear point of concern whenever I see that in an athlete. I think another big thing is like you're beginning to question everything that you're doing. So I mean, like, especially for my clients where I'm like, hey, I have this laid out very like systematically. You're going to see where we need to be every single week. But towards the tail end, if like everything is starting to become that question of like, but is this going to be enough? Is this going to be working? And it's like, yes, like you should generally expect that you're going to have moments where you pause and wonder, like, is the diet still effective? But not to the extent where you're questioning your progress every single moment of every single day. And like, sure, there's the physiological effects that like, certainly can play a role, and you can begin to see signs and manifestations of your body just like not responding. And I think this is even more so the case in contest prep, but this is very much something to pay attention to in terms of biofeedback for the non-competitor, because it's like, if you're waking up, you're constantly under recovered, you're losing touch with that overarching goal, you don't feel any of that motivation, even when you do see that rate of loss begin to catch up and reflect what you're hoping for. Yes, we could be looking at something that's a little more deep seated, that is, your body saying like, hey, this is time. Like this is the most that we can push before we start regressing. And the big telltale sign to me is like when you begin to have a lot of anxiety and a lot of fear of having to continue to dig and to make more adjustments that ultimately, yes, will get you to the goal. And that's where the way I see this manifest is like a negativity relative to like, hey, this person is like, I still have another 5 pounds to lose. And I'm like, okay, well, we're not losing at the presumed rate of loss. And we're seeing this over the course of multiple weeks. So we need to ultimately increase the deficit either by lowering food or increasing output. And whenever I like make that suggestion, like, hey, this is what needs to happen in order to continue to see progress. If there's this overwhelming sense of like dread or this like negativity that comes with like, I just can't do that, or I just like, I'm very resistant to wanting to do that. That's when I begin to question, okay, like, have we pushed to a point where from here on in, this is not going to be nearly as productive, even though just in theory, like just putting someone at these calories, putting them at this cardio, this should result in more progress. And I think if any of these resonate with you, I think it's time to ask yourself, like, hey, is the path that you're on, is it still serving you? And are you really staying committed just based on fear or wasted effort? And remember that, like, the point of doing this is supposed to help you feel better. Like, truly, this is supposed to be something that you become a better athlete for. You're supposed to feel better generally about your body, even if it is uncomfortable. But if you find that you're moving further and further away from your goals, and then like this cloud of negativity is just like harboring over you as like, well, yeah, like now I'm associating everything that I'm doing as a negative, like really as just like, well, I'm going to do this and sure, it's going to get me to my goals, but it's going to take a lot of suffering. That's really the time where I would consider reassessing. So really, this is where we have to ask, okay, how do you know when to keep going? And how do you know when to pivot? And that's where I think doing like a performance review of the diet comes in. And you really need to evaluate whether the current approach is still the right one for you, even if it's time for a different strategy. And I think like when we look at a performance review, yes, this applies to, or this is applied in a way where we really audit like how much weight have you lost? How much weight do you still need to lose? And you need to assess if your current diet is actually getting you closer to your goals, or if it's really creating these like hidden costs that eventually are going to come back and haunt you. And one key concept here is understanding dietary debt. So, what kind of dietary debt am I accruing by being adherent to the current measures? And am I prepared to pay this off post diet? So, when I talk about dietary debt, this is really referring to the fatigue, the stress that your body and mind accumulate over time. And this largely is referring to like the prolonged restriction, whether it's cutting calories too low, eliminating entire food groups, or just simply running on very low willpower, or having to exert all of your willpower every single day for too long of a duration. And I like to think of it like financial debt. Like every time you push your body past its limits without allowing it to recover properly, you're borrowing against your future well-being. And for example, like extreme restriction, it might work in the short term. Like this might be something that like you're like, okay, the last 3-4 weeks of contest prep, they're going to suck major dick. But yeah, you're losing weight, you're hitting targets, but like underneath it, you are still accumulating debt in the form of metabolic slowdown, increased cravings, hormonal imbalances, and mental burnout. And over time, this debt will need to be paid off. And maybe you rationalize it with like, okay, well, this is the first time I'm getting as lean as I've ever gotten. The goal still warrants that I do this. And I still feel like, okay, it might be a little rocky coming out of it, but I know generally this is tolerable. And whenever people push past really what they can tolerate, this often leads to that excessive weight regain, binging, or just a total collapse in dietary discipline once you reach the end of the diet. And this is typically what we see with individuals post-show when it's like you pushed, like in the case of coaches, like you push them too hard to a point that now they are so far from being able to adhere to anything, let alone something that is going to be reasonable and ultimately going to be harder for them to adhere to now that they are post-contest. And like, I think you can ask questions and you can like really assess for yourself, like, are the current restrictions sustainable in the long run? And when I think about like, okay, the biggest deficits that I've been in, okay, I was doing 2 hours of cardio a day, eating like 1,000 calories, and I did this for an extended period of time. No, that's not sustainable. And even during the time, like I knew I'm like, this is bullshit. And it wasn't like, hey, I'm going to blame the coach. It was rather, man, like, the fact that I'm having to do this, I'm having to be in like 1,000+ calorie deficits a day, that's a sign to me that the diet itself was not planned correctly, because there's no reason that having 20 weeks, 25 weeks, that I shouldn't have been able to lose the total amount of weight with some spare time to get ready and like bring food back up, pull cardio back down. And sure, if we're talking like a day, a week, maybe we just push a little bit. Maybe it makes a little bit of sense, to dig to bring the perfect look to stage. Now, in the case of someone who's not getting ready for contest prep, that's where you really have to ask, like, why are you taking such extreme measures to what? To conclude a diet that ultimately, like, there's no way you can sustain these results, because the things that you needed to do to get these results and to really put yourself in position, they're so costly. Will I be able to transition out of this diet without overeating or rebounding? Largely for the non-contest prep client, I've had clients who've come to me who are like, hey, I want to get ready, but not for a show. I just want to lose body fat as if we're going to do a prep. And then maybe closer to the end of it, we can decide if that translates into getting on stage. Typically in this case, it's very obvious in the first few weeks whether or not this person is really serious about not wanting to do a show. Sometimes the focus can shift and can really float more towards like, no, I really want to get on stage. And that's where ultimately the goal of getting on stage shouldn't be predicated by just simply wanting to get on stage. It should be predicated on, do I have all the tools and do I have the willpower to do the things that I need to do to get on stage, to bring that conditioning? And can I do it in a way that's going to allow me to come out of this prep? And even if it's not perfect, I shouldn't be like spiraling. I shouldn't be completely averse to following any kind of dietary regimen to the point that I'm like, no, like I don't want to track. I don't want to eat any of the foods I was eating during prep. And really, you have to ask yourself, like, am I setting myself up for a cycle of deprivation and indulgence post-diet? And if the answer is no, like you're building up dietary debt that eventually is you're going to need to pay off with a large degree of physical recovery, as well as like a period of mental recalibration. Well, the longer you accumulate this debt, the harder it's going to be to maintain that progress. So it's important to evaluate the true cost of your diet and everything that goes into, what you're sacrificing, which is why rather than someone like completely turning their life upside down and creating this environment that they're only able to sustain with the hope of a show in mind, to me, I feel like that almost definitively puts them in a position where coming out of it, they're going to revert back to their previous behaviors and likely put themselves in a position where they're gaining weight at an unexpectedly quick rate. Now, like even for clients who are not wanting to get on stage, yes, sacrifice is a part of achieving any goal, but it shouldn't feel like you're punishing yourself at every turn. And if the sacrifices are really starting to outweigh the benefits, I would say it's probably time to reassess whether this plan is sustainable. Now, when I think about like, okay, for a client who, maybe isn't a competitive athlete, isn't wanting to get on stage, I'm like, when we start to see adherence go, I mean, very rarely is someone able to smooth that out. And I mean, I almost equate it to like getting speed wobbles on a scooter. It's like, if you begin to lose your balance, I mean, like, sure, you might be able to course correct, but what led to that imbalance? What led to you almost crashing? And if that's something that's reoccurring, if that's something that's now occurring semi-frequently, that to me is a sign that we need to wrap it up. And that's where I talk about this pretty often, is like the skill of dieting, the skill of managing this fatigue and managing the internal state that accompanies the discomfort and the adaptive dysregulations that occur from being on low food and high output. It's like, some people are mentally better equipped to handle that. And some people, they have handled it in other facets of their life. So doing it in a contest prep is not necessarily a big ask, but it's really for the individuals who have been exposed to less of these kinds of discomforts, very specific to, hunger signaling and, high fatigue. It's in these cases that you don't want to overbid and you don't want to dig yourself into this hole that ultimately is going to take just as long, if not even longer, to crawl out of. Now, this is where I think really looking at like, what is it going to take for you to reach your goals and figuring out what you actually need to be successful and whether the approach you're taking is helping or hindering that progress. So I've had clients who they fucked up on their diets in the middle of prep. We've been like in prep 6-7 weeks. They go off track and they're pretty big binges. And I'm like, okay, the fact that this came, seemingly out of nowhere, and this was something that like you couldn't predict, you couldn't like telegraph and be like, hey, like I'm starting to have like high degrees of cravings or difficulty adhering to the diet. That to me is a problem, because I'm like, if it's an isolated instance where it's like, okay, it happened one time, like, you had lower inhibitions, like you just made a bad decision. Okay, that's one thing we can course correct. And I've had that happen myself, where it's like unknowingly, like the adherence was very much unintentional, or it was a moment of weakness. And I'm like, yeah, like I'm not going to continue with that. So I'm not going to put myself in those positions where I have a likelihood of being non-adherent. but it's in the state where someone's living in that degree of like, they require such a high degree of willpower to be adherent. That to me is a very telltale sign that the diet is not sustainable and that we don't have long before they get to a point where they're non-adherent and they eventually slip up. And like, I'll typically have clients where they'll be like, okay, I went off track, but instead of just getting back on the plan today, I think I want to overcompensate. I want to pull food down even further, or I want to do a little bit more cardio. And truly, like, when I start bargaining with like, okay, how do we undo the fuck up? It's like, that in itself, like, it happened for a reason, assuming that it wasn't just like isolated. And in the case where it does happen and it happens because of a moment of weakness, really what I want to do is take it to where that client is not putting themselves exactly in that same position the following day or the following week. Now, let's talk about opportunity cost, because this is really important, and it's what you're sacrificing by staying committed to a plan that might not be serving you and might actually be digging you and putting you in a worse position than you were previously. So in the case of a fat loss phase, you may think that like, okay, if I just compensate for the overage, or if I just keep pushing despite the very clear physical signs that I'm looking to be non-adherent, I'm likely going to fall off track soon. You could ultimately put yourself in a position where you're now underfed even more than before. Now it's required that you have to hit a bigger deficit the following day or the following week. And if adherence was already rocky at the current deficit, I mean, let's just for reference be like 500 calorie deficit, that worked for you, but over the course of 8 to 12 weeks, somewhere in between there, things started to dwindle. Maybe week 11, week 12, you have your first slip up. So what degree of a slip up are we talking about? Is it like, hey, I had a piece of candy that, was in the candy drawer, and I just like, I'm sorry, I got weak, I had a fight with my husband, and then like I just took a piece and like whatever, it was just that. Versus I've been dieting for 12 weeks. Every day I have to convince myself to walk out of the kitchen, and today I couldn't do it. So I just ate half of what was in the fridge. I had a lot of food. I have no idea how much I ate. Also, I went into the pantry and had a bunch of foods that I haven't had for months just because I know that they're in there. They look at me every day. And just generally, I know that I'm not going to have these foods for a long period of time. So I went ahead and had a little bit of everything. And this is where you really have to ask yourself, whether you're in prep, whether you are not in prep and just in a fat loss phase. What are you sacrificing by prolonging this period if it's no longer productive? And like, the obvious thing to me is if you need more muscle, you are sacrificing the ability to get more muscle, because in a contest prep or in a fat loss phase, you're not going to build. And if this is something that you're like, okay, the only reason that I'm trying to get as lean as I'm trying to get is to have more visibility, to have specific lines in my abs, to have more definition in my lower body. If you are in the pursuit of getting as lean as you need to be, and the measures you have to take to get that lean are ultimately too extreme on account of not having muscle, well, to me, that seems like a very obvious point to consider whether or not you should continue with that diet. Now, when I look at like my third and fourth show of a season, I had injured my serratus, but instead of pulling out, I really felt like, okay, I've already made this commitment. I know that, I've signed contracts, I've booked hotels, I've booked flights. And really, I was like, I don't think I have the ability to pull out of these shows. And I believed it. And frankly, being my first pro season, I wasn't really sure. Like, hey, am I going to get like blacklisted if I say that I'm going to do these shows and then decide not to? The reality is, even at the pro level, you have a lot of flexibility, and no, it's not good etiquette, and it's not necessarily like respectful to be like, I'm going to do the show and then a week before to pull out. But when I look back at that season, I think back, and if someone had told me like, hey, this isn't really going to work out the way that you think it's going to, you're not going to be nearly as lean because your training is now going to be downregulated for the next several weeks. You're going to struggle tremendously with holding your poses, because in order to twist and hit your poses, you need to be able to contract those muscles. And frankly, because my serratus was torn, I was like, I'm not going to have that ability to hit those poses nearly the way that I want to. And what do you know? The results were that my showings, yes, I may have placed decently, but the showings weren't great. Like, I look back at those pictures and I'm like, well, yeah, like they were good, and like I was very lean, but the fact is, like, I was compensating so much for being at that lower state. And really, if I could go back and tell myself, I would have just said, hey, call it before you get to that point, because the amount of work you're going to have to put forth just to get on stage in that state, it's not going to be worth it. And really, worst of all, the results didn't reflect the effort I put in. And I had already invested a lot into that prep. I had pushed myself further than I ever had, but the price I paid was far greater, because now I have those placings and I can look back and think, wow, like I had the ability to call my season after my pro debut. I could have very much said like, hey, I'm injured. There's no way I can make these shows. And frankly, no one would have cared. But instead, I convinced myself that, it made sense. I was already as lean as I needed to be for the shows. And frankly, I should just finish out the season like I originally planned. Now, the other case, and this is one that like I have multiple experiences of myself, but I also have clients who have gone into this state where frankly, they get into a fat loss phase, they continue to diet past a point that they thought they were initially going to, and they find like it's still not the shape they were hoping for. So even though the initial portion of the diet, maybe the first 8 weeks, they were like really just motivated and continuing to see like very positive results, eventually they got to the point where it's like, well, yeah, the scale weight's going down, but I'm not really filling out my clothes the way I was hoping. I'm beginning to lose the things that really make me curvy, which ultimately are actually biting me in the ass now, because now when I go to take check-in pictures, I'm not seeing that same shape. I'm beginning to question whether my waist is getting bigger. And even though measurements might technically still be the same, it's still one of those things that like you can only dwindle down so much of what isn't there. Like body fat can go down, but there's going to be a point where there's not a lot left to lose. And if you don't have the muscle, it's probably not going to be the shape that you were initially aiming for. And now in the case of someone who truly like you just fell behind, like, maybe you're halfway through your prep and you're like, I don't know, like I think that I can just continue to grind. You really have to ask yourself the tough question. Is it worth continuing? Or would you be better if you put your time and energy and you put it towards a prep that might be a little bit further out? So maybe instead of shooting for that show that's in 6 weeks that sure, technically, like theoretically you can make, but you're going to accrue a ton of dietary debt. What if we looked at a show that's 4 weeks from then? Or what if we looked at a show that, potentially is 12 weeks from then? If you're already having issues with adherence, it's unlikely that that's going to improve. It's unlikely that you're going to be able to pull back and find that equilibrium again in terms of behavior. So continuing to push forward only to show up either under conditioned or even like with this half-assed like project that essentially is only showcasing the first part of the diet because you couldn't really finish out the rest of the diet. I would much rather have someone call it at that 8 to 10 week mark and be like, okay, we need to regroup. We need to assess whether or not it makes sense to continue to do this show. If you're not going to be your best, what is the point of getting on stage? Because ultimately, I think that is most people's goal, is to get on stage showcasing their best physique. And in the case where someone just wants to cross the finish line, just wants to do the prep, I think it's important at that point to have that conversation with them, or even in your case, if you're looking at this fat loss phase yourself, maybe you're managing yourself, really understand that like, okay, if you can't show up with your best physique, if you can't hit the stage, very confident in the physique you're bringing, how is that going to affect performance the day of? And are you okay with potentially getting awarded a lower placing, knowing that it's still going to require a shitload of work in order to do so? And I think ultimately what needs to happen, like how to course correct, how to take action, if you're not in a state of contest prep, if you're just in a fat loss phase, I want you to think about what it's going to feel like and what is the best outcome if you continued the diet in the current state you're in. So with your best efforts right now, which I would say for most people, it's reasonable to assume as you continue to diet, fatigue is going to accumulate. You're going to likely have slip-ups here and there. So yeah, maybe you can shave off another 2-3 pounds. But in my experience, I find that people are in a much better position when we can end the diet before those slip-ups occur. So I almost think about it, and this is one of the questions I ask clients on a weekly basis, whether they're in contest prep or not. How do you feel about what we're doing? Is it hard to maintain the deficit? Because realistically, I want to identify when it starts to become a little hard, when it starts to become a little bit challenging. And I want to know generally when adherence could likely begin to slip. And usually it's not just this random occurrence. Usually it is something that accumulates in the background over the course of several weeks. But if we can catch that before it becomes unmanageable, we can ease out of the diet and we can begin to reverse diet. Almost never is someone going to find that like taking hefty extremes at the end of a fat loss phase is going to result in a better outcome post diet. And ultimately, one of the biggest challenges that I think people deal with after any kind of fat loss phase is not regaining that weight. Now, the way you can set yourself up for success is only taking the necessary amount of measures in order to get the fat off. So maybe in a contest prep, maybe that is something that's more extreme. But if you're constantly overextending yourself and putting yourself in a position where just to see progress on a regular basis, just to meet that minimum rate of change, you're having to really sacrifice a ton of willpower, or I guess practice a ton of willpower on a regular basis, almost putting you at the cusp of being non-adherent every day. That's not a great sign. That's not where you want to be. And ideally, if we can get you to a point where we end the diet before you get to that point, that's going to put you in a better position to where post diet, maybe we can begin to increase food. You can begin to regain some of that confidence back and begin to undo some of those dysregulations that occurred from being in that fat loss state. I think ultimately this comes down to reframing, pulling out of a diet or concluding a diet, reframing it rather as a failure and instead as a sign of maturity. And if we can rather put you in a position where you can then come out of it with ease and be in a little bit more of a productive state immediately after, you're going to be better off for that. I think it's important to understand, like, you're not making the wrong decision. Like, you're not weak or you're not a bad athlete. You don't suck at dieting if you decide like, hey, this isn't continuing to serve me. This is going to give you opportunity to learn what didn't work for you. And ultimately, this is going to allow you to create space for what will allow you to move forward in a better manner. But the next time you catch yourself saying things like, I've already put so much time into this, I can't pull out, I've already come this far, I can't quit. Really ask yourself, are you holding on because it's working, or are you afraid to admit that it's not? The sunk cost fallacy is sneaky. And it's something that once you recognize, you can begin to start making decisions that move you forward and don't hold you back. Ultimately, I don't think that's an easy decision to make, but I think it's something you can gain a lot of equity by making sooner than later. I hope you guys liked this episode. I hope it was helpful. Please let me know what you think in the comments below. As always, like, comment, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.